The sun was setting over the small town of Oakdale, casting a warm orange glow over the quaint streets and homes. In one of those homes, a beautiful two-story house with a wraparound porch, lived Sheriff Jack Harris and his wife, Sarah. They had been married for over 20 years, and to the outside world, their life seemed perfect. His fairness and kindness. He was a pillar of strength, always ready to lend a helping hand or offer a listening ear. Sarah, on the other hand, was a devoted wife and mother, always putting the needs of others before her own. She was a talented cook and homemaker, and their home was always filled with the delicious smells of her baking. Their children, Emily and James, were the apple of their parents' eyes. Emily was a bright and cheerful high school student, always eager to help others and make her parents proud. James was a rambunctious and energetic young boy, always getting into mischief and keeping his parents on their toes. To the outside world, the Harris family seemed like the epitome of perfection. They were a family that had it all: love, happiness, and success. But, as with all things, appearances can be deceiving. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the town in a dark and foreboding shadow, the Harris family's perfect facade began to crack. The seeds of secrets and lies, planted long ago, began to sprout, threatening to destroy the very foundation of their lives. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the town in a dark and foreboding shadow, the Harris family's perfect facade began to crack. The seeds of secrets and lies, planted long ago, began to sprout, threatening to destroy the very foundation of their lives. The theme of the story began to emerge, like a ghostly presence lurking in the shadows. It was a theme that would explore the darker side of human nature, the destructive power of secrets and lies, and the devastating consequences of unchecked emotions. As the night wore on, the Harris family's secrets and lies began to simmer just below the surface, waiting to erupt into a cauldron of chaos and destruction. The perfect facade was about to crack, revealing a web of deceit and betrayal that would change their lives forever. The sun was shining brightly on the small town of Oakdale, casting a warm glow over the streets and homes. But for Sheriff Jack Harris, the day was about to take a dramatic turn. Jack had always thought of himself as a good husband and father. He had provided for his family, been a steady presence in their lives, and had always tried to do the right thing. But as he walked into his house that afternoon, he was met with a sight that would shatter his world forever. Sarah, his wife of over 20 years, was standing in the living room, her face flushed and her eyes guilty. And standing next to her, his arm around her waist, was a younger man, a man that Jack had never seen before. For a moment, Jack's mind went blank. He couldn't process what he was seeing. He felt like he had been punched in the gut, like all the air had been sucked out of him. As the confrontation continued, the tension in the room grew thicker. Jack's anger and hurt boiled over, and he said things he would regret later. Sarah, too, said things that she would later regret, things that would cut deep and leave scars that would never heal. The argument ended with Sarah storming out of the house, leaving Jack alone to pick up the pieces of his shattered world. Jack was left to wonder how his life had fallen apart so quickly, how the woman he loved could betray him so deeply. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks turned into months, Jack's world continued to spiral out of control. He became withdrawn and isolated, unable to face the world or himself. He felt like he was living in a dark cloud, a cloud that would never lift. And yet, even amid his pain and anger, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that he was somehow to blame. He felt like he had failed Sarah, like he had driven her into the arms of another man. As the months turned into years, Jack's guilt and shame continued to grow. He became trapped in a cycle of self-blame and recrimination, unable to escape the prison of his own mind. One day, Jack's emotions finally boiled over. He and Sarah had been arguing for hours, their voices raised in a heated and bitter exchange. Jack's anger and hurt had reached a boiling point one day, and he felt like he was going to explode over. In a fit of rage, Jack grabbed Sarah and shook her violently. Their voices raised in a heated and bitter exchange. He felt like he was losing control. Jack's anger and hurt no longer in charge of his own actions, and he felt like he was going to explode. In a fit of rage, Jack grabbed Sarah and shook her violently. He felt like he was losing control. like he was no longer in charge of his own actions. And then, in a moment of pure madness, Jack snapped. He felt a surge of adrenaline and anger, and he struck Sarah with all his might. Sarah's body crumpled to the floor, her eyes frozen in a permanent stare. Jack stood over her, his chest heaving with exertion, his mind reeling with the consequences of his actions. At first, Jack was in a state of denial. He couldn't believe what he had done, couldn't accept the reality of his actions. He felt like he was living in a dream, like he was trapped in a never-ending nightmare. But as the reality of his actions began to sink in, Jack's panic and desperation grew. He knew that he had to get rid of Sarah's body, had to find a way to cover up his crime. And so, he made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Using his knowledge of mortuary science, Jack decided to embalm Sarah's body himself. He had learned the basics of embalming in college, and he had even helped out at a local funeral home from time to time. He felt confident that he could preserve Sarah's body, could keep her looking lifelike for as long as he needed. And so, Jack set to work. He gathered his supplies and began the process of embalming Sarah's body. It was a gruesome and disturbing task, but Jack felt like he had no choice. He was desperate to avoid detection, desperate to keep his secret safe. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks turned into months, Jack's obsession with Sarah's body grew. He began to create a shrine-like environment in his home, a place where he could continue to interact with Sarah and pretend that she was still alive. Jack would spend hours talking to Sarah's body, would sit with her and watch TV, would even eat meals with her. He felt like he was keeping her alive, like he was preserving their relationship even in death. But as the months turned into years, Jack's grip on reality began to slip. He became increasingly isolated and withdrawn, unable to face the world or himself. He felt like he was living in a dream, like he was trapped in a never-ending nightmare. And yet, despite the madness that was growing inside him, Jack couldn't bring himself to let go of Sarah's body. He felt like she was still with him, like she was still a part of his life. And so, he continued to care for her, continued to talk to her and interact with her, even as the world around him began to crumble. As the years went by, Jack's secret became increasingly difficult to maintain. His children, Emily and James, grew up and moved out of the house, starting their own lives and leaving Jack alone with his memories. But Jack couldn't let go of the past. He was stuck in a cycle of grief and guilt, unable to move on from Sarah's death. He continued to care for her body, continued to talk to her and interact with her, even as the world around him changed. The house, once a warm and welcoming home, began to fall into disrepair. The walls were covered in dust, the furniture was worn and faded, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. But Jack didn't notice. He was too caught up in his own world, too consumed by his own grief and guilt. He was a man stuck in time, unable to move forward, unable to let go of the past. And then, one day, the sheriff's department received an anonymous tip about a suspicious smell coming from Jack's house. The tip was vague, but it was enough to raise suspicions. A team of deputies was dispatched to Jack's house, led by the new sheriff, a no-nonsense woman named Sheriff Jenkins. They arrived at the house, their guns drawn, their hearts pounding with anticipation. Jack answered the door, his eyes wild and his hair disheveled. He looked like a man who had been caught in the act, like a man who had been living a lie. "Sheriff Harris, we need to talk," Sheriff Jenkins said, her voice firm and commanding. Jack's eyes darted back and forth, his mind racing with possibilities. He knew that he had been caught, knew that his secret was finally out. And then, in a moment of pure madness, Jack snapped. He lunged at the deputies, his fists flying, his eyes blazing with anger. The deputies were caught off guard, but they quickly regained their composure. They subdued Jack, pinning him to the ground, and then they entered the house, searching for the source of the suspicious smell. The deputies were shocked and horrified, unable to comprehend the magnitude of Jack's secret. They arrested him on the spot, charging him with murder and desecration of a corpse. As Jack was led away in handcuffs, he caught a glimpse of Sarah's body, still sitting in the chair, still looking peaceful and serene. He felt a pang of sadness and loss. knowing that he would never be able to be with her again. But as he looked into her eyes, he saw something that made his blood run cold. He saw a look of accusation, a look of betrayal. And in that moment, Jack knew that he was doomed. As the days passed, Jack's world began to crumble around him. He was arrested and charged with Sarah's murder, as well as the desecration of her corpse. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and Jack knew that he was facing a long and difficult road ahead. As he sat in his cell, awaiting trial, Jack's mental state began to deteriorate. He became increasingly detached from reality, unable to comprehend the magnitude of his actions. He would often find himself lost in thought, reliving memories of Sarah and their life together. The trial was a blur for Jack. He sat in the courtroom, his eyes fixed on the floor, as the prosecution presented their case against him. The evidence was damning, and Jack knew that he was guilty. But he couldn't bring himself to admit it, not even to himself. As the trial drew to a close, Jack's mental state continued to deteriorate. He became increasingly paranoid, convinced that everyone was out to get him. He would often lash out at his lawyers, accusing them of betraying him. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. Jack was found guilty of Sarah's murder, as well as the desecration of her corpse. The judge sentenced him to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. As Jack was led away in handcuffs, he caught a glimpse of his children, Emily and James, sitting in the courtroom. They looked at him with a mixture of sadness and disgust, and Jack knew that he had lost them forever. The prison doors closed behind Jack, and he was plunged into a world of darkness and despair. He was a man who had lost everything: his family, his freedom, and his sanity. He was a man who was trapped in his own private hell, with no escape in sight. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks turned into months, Jack's life in prison became a monotonous routine. He would wake up every morning, go through the motions of eating and exercising, and then spend the rest of the day locked in his cell, lost in thought. At first, Jack's mind was consumed by anger and resentment. He was angry at the world for judging him, angry at his lawyers for not being able to get him off, and angry at himself for letting things get so out of control. But as the months went by, Jack's anger began to give way to a sense of sadness and regret. He realized that he had thrown away his life, his family, and his freedom, all for the sake of his own selfish desires. One day, as Jack was sitting in his cell, he received a visit from his children, Emily and James. They were grown now, with families of their own, but they still looked at Jack with a mixture of sadness and disappointment. "Dad, why?" Emily asked, her voice shaking with emotion. "Why did you do it? Why did you kill Mom?" Jack looked at his children, and for the first time, he saw the devastating consequences of his actions. He saw the pain and suffering that he had caused, and he knew that he could never make it right. "I don't know," Jack said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was angry, and I was hurt. I didn't think about anyone else, I only thought about myself." Emily and James looked at each other, and then back at Jack. They saw the remorse in his eyes, and they knew that he was truly sorry for what he had done. As the visit came to an end, Jack's children hugged him, and for the first time in years, Jack felt a sense of peace. He knew that he would never be able to go back to the way things were before, but he also knew that he had taken the first step toward redemption. As Jack sat in his cell, he realized that he had been given a rare gift, the chance to confront the reality of his actions and to make amends for the harm that he had caused. The story of Jack's downfall was a tragic one, a cautionary tale about the destructive power of human nature. It was a reminder that our actions have consequences and that the secrets and lies that we tell ourselves can ultimately lead to our own destruction. As the years went by, Jack's legend grew, a reminder to all of the devastating consequences of unchecked ambition and desire. And though he would never be able to escape the prison of his own making, Jack knew that he had finally found a measure of peace, a sense of closure that would stay with him for the rest of his days. The story of Jack and Sarah serves as a cautionary tale about the destructive power of secrets, lies, and unchecked emotions. Jack's actions had devastating consequences, not just for himself, but for his children, his community, and even his wife's memory.